the invitation and for engaging my work, specifically this article that was published in the CENTRO Journal back in last fall 2022, on the corruption issue. So first, I'm just gonna kind of situate this article that was shared with you today within my larger research project. And then I'll talk a bit about the Centro special issue on corruption and kind of how I worked with the framing of disaster fraud for this article. And then I'm going to review the central questions, arguments, and concerns that I address here, and close with a brief discussion around my comparison with post-Katrina New Orleans. So just to situate this article in my larger book project that Dr. Garcia mentioned, called Reimagining Recovery, Debt, Mutual Aid, and Disaster Governance in Puerto Rico, this article is part of a larger project that analyzes the politics and lived experiences of debt and climate disaster recovery in Puerto Rico, and specifically how people navigate crisis, what crisis means and how it's lived in daily life, and also how different groups are envisioning what recovery looks like in Puerto Rico for whom are recovery projects meant for. And I collaborated with two main groups for this research, and it was an interesting it was an interesting collaboration because they gave me very different perspectives on the current overlapping crises in Puerto Rico. The first one, my main field sites and participants were specifically a group of activist women from Las Carolinas Caguas, in the municipality of Caguas, and that's kind of the research site I'll be mostly addressing today and what comes out in this article. And secondly, the Auditoría Ya, a social movement calling for a citizen audit of Puerto Rico's debt. And these folks are a group of activists, legal practitioners, scholars, young folks, really based in the San Juan urban area. And I highlight the participants in Las Carolinas here. That's whom I'll really be talking about today. And in this community, I was interested in how disaster recovery processes after Hurricane Maria were impacting the social reproductive lives of women and elders in this community, and really how residents were mobilizing what I talk about as a politics of mutual aid and spatial rescue and occupation to foster recovery on their own terms. And they did this by organizing a Centro de Apoyo Mutuo, or mutual aid center, in the neighborhood. And this was part of a larger movement of Centros de Apoyo Mutuo around the entire archipelago of Puerto Rico. I'm happy to share links to some colleagues' work who have focused more specifically on the broader movement of Centros de Apoyo Mutuo, but they were, really social hubs and organizing hubs in communities that were the first responders in disaster recovery. And a number of them, such as this one in Las Carolinas, are actually still operating today. So I did about 18 months of ethnographic fieldwork in Puerto Rico between 2018 and 2019. And my methods really centered around interviews, participant observation, oral histories, archival research, documentary analysis. And I kind of situate my work in terms of feminist engaged ethnography. So this to me is very grounded in collaboration and solidarity, and also a political commitment to thinking about how anthropologists and social scientists more broadly can inform debates around social justice in Puerto Rico. So in relation to this work, right, it's around kind of this idea of just recovery, just disaster recovery. And I'm currently preparing my dissertation as a book manuscript, a very exciting process to be getting into now. And also just want to acknowledge how I enter the conversation in Puerto Rican studies is always from a point of solidarity. I'm not Puerto Rican myself, but I come from over a decade of engagement in scholarly work with Puerto Rican studies and also activist work in the diaspora for Puerto Rico. And I'm really happy actually to have here someone who was one of my early mentors, Dr. Clara Rodriguez from Fordham University. So I just wanted to briefly touch on this kind of frame of corruption because it was not the expected framework that I had in mind to discuss disaster governance and property relations in this research. So the invitation came up to contribute to this special issue. And I had to think a lot about it because I knew I wanted to write about property and the different forms of exclusion in the housing recovery aid processes. And I had this kind of click when I started to read case studies outside of Puerto Rico. So really specifically, New Orleans was a big eye-opener for me. And the kind of framing this work around disaster fraud allowed me to do a number of things. It allowed me to think about how anti-corruption narratives play out in the mundane kind of everyday spheres of life, and how seemingly neutral evaluative practices that are scrutinizing survivors' applications for home repair aid, how those are playing out in terms of property relations. And it allowed me to provide a different lens because I noticed in the literature a major focus of disaster fraud are usually like these large-scale corruption issues, what we might think about as disaster capitalism. But so I wanted to kind of think about it in the more everyday sphere. And this, again, led me to kind of integrate secondary sources and a comparative lens briefly in the article around New Orleans, which I'll touch on later. But just, I thought it was really interesting the way that the editors of this corruption issue framed corruption as this kind of ubiquitous condition, a seemingly ubiquitous condition in Puerto Rico, and what's usually used as a catch-all explanation. And at the same time, really attractive for US media headlines to grab on to write Puerto Rico's corruption. So the editors were trying to trouble this, this tendency and to think about corruption and anti-corruption, as they say, quote, as a narrative mobilized across time and space with varying effects, shaped by colonial and racist structures, end quote. And thinking about the implications of corruption narratives in Puerto Rico and for Puerto Ricans. So, sorry about this here. I just want to highlight this quote, which I have in the article, which I think is kind of the central problem that I was trying to address here. Despite Puerto Rico's legal framework, where official titles do not determine ownership and FEMA's own guidelines, unverified ownership was the most common reason that FEMA denied housing recovery aid to survivors after Hurricane Maria, totaling about 77,000 denied households. And this is actually citing the work of some folks here. And this kind of leads into the practical and theoretical problems I was trying to address. Practically, there was a lot of attention after Hurricane Maria in the legal and political realm and in these conversations around widespread FEMA denials due to title issues, housing title issues. And this category of unverified ownership came up as the most common reason for denials. But there was less attention at the time at documenting the lived process of how folks were experiencing this bureaucratic weight. And so that's where I was hoping that anthropology would come in and ethnography could help make a contribution to. And I noticed that the issue of FEMA aid denials was coming up continuously in conversations with my research collaborators during field work, especially in the neighborhood I was working in Caguas. Even the Residents Association, for example, was doing their own local tracking of the denials because there were so many in this one neighborhood. And as I mentioned in the article, this sector has been shaped historically by the parcela property formations and the parcela distribution earlier in the 20th century. And so the current kind of property situation in this sector is very diverse, which kind of gave the basis of a lot of confusion for the federal evaluators around issues of title. And of course, the contradiction again is that a title, what's called the título de propiedad in Puerto Rico, is not required here to legally convey one's ownership. But it was actually the kind of only form of legible proof that federal evaluators were looking for when they were evaluating home damage. So that was a big contradiction. FEMA's own guidelines did not suggest that it was required to have a home evaluated, nor does Puerto Rico's law require property titles for ownership. But the situation was that this experience was coming up against the federal evaluations. And I think theoretically, I was interested in thinking about, what do property relations and bureaucratic evaluative encounters reveal about disaster governance and the inequalities that emerge in disaster recovery processes. So I wanted to integrate a few key debates in the article, specifically around housing recovery and disaster fraud that I spoke a little bit about, and I'll come back to in relation to Hurricane Katrina. Around property, right? Property has for a long time been a lot of interest to anthropologists, specifically thinking about property as a dynamic social relation. And this was also kind of an example of how I was trying to approach an ethnography of the state, right? Looking at bureaucratic processes of exclusion via state effects, what Michel Truthout called state effects. And the article, examines disaster governance through what I call bureaucratic encounters, these everyday encounters with federal officials, and the anti-corruption narratives that FEMA mobilized during their home aid evaluations right after Hurricane Maria. And I argue that property and ownership is really a central sphere through which disaster governance is mobilized and also contested in Puerto Rico. And that the concern around how homeownership is verified or made legible plays out on two scales. So first, in the realm of individual home repair, so this is where the supposedly neutral categories of ownership that FEMA uses to determine eligibility for aid. And secondly, within this larger kind of national recovery schema and what's called resilience building, right? There's a lot of federal money allocated to specifically title clearance programs in Puerto Rico that many scholars focused on housing justice have critiqued as patchwork solutions that are, perhaps just trying to make properties more legible for the housing market, not addressing people's actual housing insecurity or how they are made vulnerable to these storms. And that was, I opened the article with a vignette where the ex Secretary of Vivienda of Housing, Fernando Gil, was kind of giving this very directing a very performative ceremony around the giving out property titles to a group of women. And I really wanted to make the point that disaster aid evaluations after storms like this and these bureaucratic encounters are never neutral spaces. The categories themselves are never neutral. And it's important to pay attention to survivors' experiences during these bureaucratic encounters and throughout the entire application process to really fully assess inequalities in aid access and also how people are understanding these processes themselves. I want to just briefly discuss a methodological point about using ethnographic evidence around the case of a single family, which is, this article, the ethnographic part and the second part of the article really focuses around one family's story. And right, to some social scientists, this might bring questions around broader relevance of a single family's case. So I want to convey that, right, the experience of one family that I was sharing in this article was replicated across space and time. And my interest was not necessarily this specific family's stories in itself, but rather what it was revealing about a social process. So what it was revealing about housing recovery and thinking about who is excluded from this and why. And it was, again, very related, this family's case was very related to what other residents in the neighborhood were experiencing, how the sector itself had historically been excluded by FEMA, and what we saw happening on a broader scale in Puerto Rico. So I'll just share with you, this is not, it's not very legible, it's a copy, but I refer to this FEMA memo from 2011 on non-traditional forms of housing in my article. And this was a really interesting document to come across because this document specifically, excludes a list of certain communities in Puerto Rico that were identified as squatter communities, right? Informal housing can be, for example, in addition, a squatter can be identified because the dwelling is not recognized by the local governmental agencies, as demonstrated by the lack of essential services, including water, electricity, telephone, etc. So this suggests, and this states very clearly, that individuals residing in what is documented here as non-traditional forms of housing are ineligible for home repair or replacement assistance since they are not the owner of the damaged dwelling. That's what the last sentence states. And this document listed about over 100 sectors in Puerto Rico. Las Carolinas, where my research took place, was one of the sectors. So I bring this into the conversation because it demonstrates the kind of historical forms of exclusion around housing recovery assistance that this community, as well as others more broadly in Puerto Rico, have experienced. And so the family's case, who I discuss in this article, their story really revealed tensions between the colonial state valuations and lived experience. The family's ultimately successful challenge to FEMA's arbitrary designation of their property arrangement as being in what they call the zona invadida, or invaded zone, which connotates squatters, self-built homes without permission or clear title. Their challenge to this designation was a way of defending their rightful ownership claim amid a landscape of exclusionary disaster fraud scrutiny. And it was very interesting to me how one participant, Evelyn, who I talk about in the article, right, she explained the struggle to assert her family's ownership claims in terms of racial violence. And she invoked the story of Adolfina Villanueva Osorio, whom I talk about in the article as well, as kind of bringing to light, like, this is part of a larger pattern of racial violence, exclusion, and struggles around land in Puerto Rico. So I thought that was, very important to bring that forward, how people are explaining and understanding these exclusions. And of course, this relates to very racialized notions of Puerto Ricans as inherently fraudulent due to informal housing conditions or property arrangements that do not fit with US-centric ideas around private property. And the idea here being that informality is inherently corrupt or fraudulent and must be surveilled and fixed. And just lastly, to kind of wrap up here, I do bring a brief comparison with New Orleans into the article post-Hurricane Katrina New Orleans, because I was very interested. Scholars after Katrina said that New Orleans kind of offers a warning that the future has arrived. And this, like, New Orleans is the future. So I think it's very important to look at, use comparative lenses in this way, and think about the broader patterns around federal disaster aid exclusion and homeownership scrutiny throughout what Guillermo Bonilla calls the US archipelago of racialized neglect, right? Thinking about New Orleans in relation to Puerto Rico allows us to kind of, understand this archipelago of racialized neglect a bit more, because in both cases, the historically marginalized communities were the most vulnerable to housing aid recovery denials, and the policing of certain property arrangements. So I was looking at secondary sources around post-Katrina New Orleans, because they were demonstrating the federal government's long-held concerns around preventing, quote unquote, disaster fraud in post-disaster sites. And for instance, the Department of Justice created a task force to investigate fraudulent claims of disaster aid after Katrina. So this is a kind of long-held concern of the federal government, and I think it comes up in interesting ways in the post-disaster context. And I think for me, the question is why and for whom is property a concern, and why in a specific moment, such as after Hurricane Katrina or after Hurricane Maria.